Come over here and kiss me on my hot mouth. I'm feeling romantical.
One Battle After Another is the 10th directorial feature film from director, writer, producer, editor, author, and filmmaker extraordinaire Paul Thomas Anderson. This is his long-awaited follow-up to Licorice Pizza that starred breakout performances from Cooper Hoffman, the son of longtime PTA collaborator Philip Seymour Hoffman, as well as Alana Haim. So going into this year, PTA was one of those directors who had always been alluring to me, but I wasn't overly aware of a lot of his stuff. I had seen There Will Be Blood as a 15-year-old, but I didn't remember a lot of it. That was nearly 10 years ago now. So going into this year, I made essentially an expedition of deliberately attempting to go through and watch all of his films. What I have to say is that his two best films, in my opinion, are basically polar opposites in terms of what they are. Those films being Magnolia and There Will Be Blood. Magnolia is hyper, it's full of these like long camera takes, long conversations, there's a lot of dialogue, there's a lot of relationship building, whereas There Will Be Blood is about a singular man. The camera doesn't move very much, it's about colour, it's about composition, and he does not talk very much. It's all in the facial expressions of Daniel Day-Lewis. One of the things that I loved the most about Magnolia was those long tracking shots, and as you go deeper and deeper into the PTA back catalogue, these become less and less frequent. With this film, One Battle After Another, there was some hope for me that they would re-emerge, given that this is a high-stakes action film and the camera seemed to be very dynamic in the trailers. I have to say that I think this film is excellent. I think this is the best film of the year, and I think that Paul Thomas Anderson is probably the only new school 90s director working today who you can probably argue has a masterpiece in every decade that he works in. Boogie Nights, Magnolia in the 90s, There Will Be Blood in the 2000s, in the 2010s, it's either The Master or Phantom Thread, and now in this decade, you have One Battle After Another. I think he's eclipsed Fincher, I think he's eclipsed Tarantino, and whoever else you want to put on that list, I'm sure he's eclipsed them too. If I was going to nitpick this film, I think that there are a couple occasions where a tracking shot could have been used and it would have really enhanced this sort of tense but comedic tone that he's going for. But with that being said, that is a nitpick because the camera is marvelous in this film. There is a shot, particularly on a car towards the end of this film, where he's coming up with stuff that feels both fresh and like I don't know how he's sort of imagined that and came up with that, but yet also feels inspired by things that he probably would have seen during his childhood in the 70s and 80s. And he has this really great knack for taking things that he's seen when he was young and then reincorporating them into his films. And it's such a breath of fresh air, let's say, when Tarantino is essentially gone at this point, at least right now. You have Fincher, who I don't really think is working at his peak right now. A lot of the stuff that he's doing, it feels very formulaic in some sense. It's very, fun, enjoyable, but I don't really feel like he's pushing the boat out. With Paul Thomas Anderson, there is something in every one of these films that I can latch onto and go, maybe I don't understand that, maybe I'm not technically proficient enough with a camera to really know what it is that I'm looking at, but always, whether it's the dialogue, whether it's the acting, the music, the camera, every one of these films, there's something going on. And the camera work in this film is exquisite. As I said, I would have preferred to have a bit more of those tracking shots, but the constant focus on one character, and the camera moves, but it stays stationary. It stays in one isolated position on location, but yet it is constantly moving from right to left, left to right, up, down, up. It's so dynamic in a way that I don't think is really there in something like There Will Be Blood or The Master or Phantom Thread. Maybe it's a bit more in vogue with something like Inherent Vice and Licorice Pizza, although I have to say I'm not a major fan of those films. He is continuing his great camera work in this film. The writing continues to be a real strong point, and for me, it's probably my favourite part of these films, other than the acting. The writing, again, is just top drawer as usual. His focus on relationships and how they can be fractious and how essentially a relationship you had 30 years ago can continue to have consequences today. And I think the fact that he is nearly 60 but yet is working with this mindset of how do I, in this case a 16-year-old, how do I relate to them, and how do I understand the struggle that they're going through, and how do I understand that my actions as a 56-year-old man has an effect on my kids, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but in 10 years, 15 years. And it's so interesting when I think more and more directors who are getting more and more older or simply attempting to just do passion projects. It's so interesting to me that we have a premier film director who is actually going, well, no, there is an audience right now among Gen Z and Gen Alpha, or among young millennials who want to be into films, who want to be cinephiles. And it is my job to appeal to them and to say, hey, listen, I get it. We might have fucked up somewhat. That's not really a viewpoint that I think we're really getting a lot from old school Hollywood now, what would have been considered the new Hollywood in the 1990s, but is now the old school Hollywood. I don't think that's a very proficient thing, let's say. I don't think Finch is very interested in that. I certainly don't think Tarantino is interested in that. If anything, Tarantino wants to go further and further back. Whilst those directors might be successful, I don't necessarily know if there's much going on in terms of let me reach out, reach an olive branch across the generations and go, you know, I get what you're saying. I understand it. And then to do it in a political way, which isn't necessarily something that Paul Thomas Anderson focuses on a lot. With every one of these films, it feels like a risk. And with every one of these films, he just knocks it out of the park. And to focus on politics, but to focus on politics through a father-daughter relationship is only possible from the mind of a writer who is particularly interested in this idea of how do politics affect the day-to-day relationship of a family, and how do the politics of a revolution affect the day-to-day reality of a family. And in this case, I think this film is actually somewhat anti-revolution, but pro-change, but pro-incremental change, and essentially argues that revolutions are so destruction-orientated that it's probably not a good idea, and it's much more relevant and possible in democracy to achieve change incrementally and by teaching generations to push it forward and to continue with this sort of incremental change. Yet despite that, even though he's arguing in favor of this change, he also writes pretty much every character in this film as being an oxymoron, as being someone who wants to achieve good, yet can't really get over the hump for whatever reason. Leonardo DiCaprio embodies this perfectly in Bob, and what he's so good at in this film is to have this humor where he's constantly joking, and a lot of the jokes and a lot of humor in this film is performative. It feels the opposite of The Wolf of Wall Street, where it feels like this belongs on a stage. He's using his body the entire time. And yes, The Wolf of Wall Street is performative, but it's also well aware that this is a performance. Whereas in this film, DiCaprio is so good at never acknowledging the camera, never acknowledges that he's in a film. He's completely sincere, yet he's completely a bit of an idiot. But also, he creates such tension around him because he cares about his daughter so much and just wants the best for her, that yes, there might be tension between them. There might be tension that he wants to get her back, but there is also humor that DiCaprio and Paul Thomas Anderson are so good at creating together, where at one moment you could be laughing, but then you're probably going, why am I laughing at that? This is terrible. And there's a chance that his daughter might die or he might die. And I'm not sure that I've seen very many directors achieve that, where you can both find something comedic and also go, this situation writ large is actually kind of terrifying, and I'm really hoping that the characters make it out of this. And that final 40 minutes is one of the most anxious feelings I've ever had during a film, where I wanted the characters, who are pretty terrible people, to get theirs and to die, but I also wanted DiCaprio and Chase Infiniti's character, his daughter, to make it out, because I felt so strongly for them. And that is a credit to the writing, and that is a credit to the performances that are on screen. And Chase Infiniti as well, I also believe holds her own. She never gets very much to say. She never really gets a crowning moment in terms of dialogue, but she really comes into her own of essentially being used and abused, I would say, in this film, and then finally caps that off with that moment where she rejects the establishment, and she almost rejects a lot of the teachings of her parents and go, well, I'm not going to do it the way that you did it. I'm going to very quietly and subtly do it my own way that isn't destructive and that isn't going to destroy the future generations of my family. Sean Penn and Teyana Taylor, I think, are great. Teyana Taylor embodying that idea that essentially revolutionaries, but also I would say in some respect greatness in the way that we perceive athletes and sports men and women. Determination to achieve one's goal is a flaw a lot of the time because it comes at the detriment of family. Teyana Taylor embodies that perfectly, of that determination and that striving to just achieve one singular thing can pretty much destroy your life and cut out every chance you had of actually achieving the thing that was worthwhile. And I found that to be a really powerful performance. She's really cool in this film, and I wasn't aware that she had any acting chops, so props to her. Sean Penn is this embodiment of what the industrial military complex, particularly the Western industrial military complex, does, which is essentially to just chew up whatever it can get its hands on and then spit it back out, even if what it's chewing up is contradictory to the propaganda and the principles that it is espousing, is so powerful. The posture that he embodies of this sort of straight-backed man who is strict in what he says but is not strict in what he does. He has these anti-race mixing ideals but then is consistently not aligned with that in his actions. A great embodiment of what it means to be in that military complex where you can say one thing and do another, and he's great in this film. I'm not altogether aware of a lot of Sean Penn's career, but this is a performance that really makes me want to go back and see more of it. Overall, this is the best film of the year for me. I've said that a few times this year, but that's because there's been a good few films that came out that I thought were top draw. But this is really a cut above pretty much everything other than maybe Eddington, Weapons, and 28 Years Later. A great film, and is probably another masterpiece in the catalogue of Paul Thomas Anderson. I don't like using the word masterpiece very often, but I'm struggling to see a lot of flaws in this film. As I said, maybe some more tracking shots I would have enjoyed, and the only other thing I would say is that the first two thirds of the film are very high octane and very hyper, but then in that third act it kind of slows down. I believe that kind of makes sense in my opinion, as you're seeing this central relationship re-emerge from that chaos, and finally, like a phoenix from the ashes, it's finally rising and getting its dues. It works for me, but I could see some criticisms of it. This should be an Oscar frontrunner, but given that it's an action film, I'm not confident of Best Director and Best Picture, but it should be up there, and I really hope it does for the sake of its performances and its director, who is yet to snag any of those top awards.
One time in my life I felt that. What was my purpose?
But ultimately, this film is, if you're putting it on a scale, it's a 9.5 or a 10 out of 10. I think it's probably a 10 out of 10. Maybe I'll go back and rewatch this again and disagree with myself slightly. But right now, this film is truly, truly top draw. And I'm struggling to see how anything else that is coming out later this year is going to stand up against this film. It's truly proficient with the camera. It's truly expansive in its vision, and yet is still focused on this one thing that is consistent throughout all of Paul Thomas Anderson's films, which is the relationship between characters.